Welcome to Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. I'd like to welcome back a familiar face to Rich Planet Television. It's mind control researcher Neil Sanders. Welcome back, Neil.
Thank you very much for having me, Richard.
And there's been a lot of people requesting that I get you back on the show, so just to let you know that. Now, as I said, Neil Sanders is a mind control researcher, and just to mention your two books, Neil, that you wrote these, what, in 2013, was it?
I did, yeah, right at the end of 2012 they came out.
Right. So the first book is entitled Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Mind Control, Mass Manipulation and Perception Management. And the second book is entitled Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Marketing, Movies and Music. Just give us a brief resume of the two books, Neil.
The first volume talks about the more physical aspects of mind control, what you might term a Manchurian candidate, which is the use of hypnosis, use of drugs, the use of various machinery in order to physically affect somebody, and that can be for an interrogation scenario, you know, like a truth serum, or it could be for an espionage type deal where you want somebody to go and spy on somebody or steal something. And the second book really talks more about the social aspects of it and all the sort of various institutions that basically comprise the world that we manage the perceptions that people have, and this would be the media, social media, the music industry, the television and film industry, and all these seemingly disparate but actually seem to form one big system.
All right. And mind control, we do suspect, is grossly underplayed in mainstream media. A lot of people are not aware of it, your average person, but there's various should we say offshoots to it, and you mentioned one of them there, and that is drugs.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about today, whether or not drugs are being used by, say, covert agencies which are not perhaps the visible government but intelligence agencies and that kind of thing, using drugs for various social engineering or even mini genocide, you might call it. And you're going to talk about the US in the 1980s. And Neil also has a presentation for sale if you want to have a look at that. It's called Welcome to Sell, the Dark Art of Marketing. Just tell us what that is, Neil.
Well, I play a character of an evil salesman. It's a satirical piece, basically. I did a presentation at the AV5, which was a sales scenario, a sales seminar, you know, like these guys do, where they're basically teaching, I'll teach you how to maximise your sales potential and stuff like that. So that's basically what I'm doing. But obviously what I'm actually telling you is I'm showing you the tricks that advertisers themselves might use. So. But if I come across as a bit brash and arrogant in there, it's a character. Okay,
well, let's get back to this. We're talking about. Well, predominantly it's the US we've been discussing.
Yeah, and I think that's mostly because the UK tends to hide it a lot better. Like task forces in America, who would be the people that would go after drugs, and they never go after the sort of the top level people. They always tend to go after users, because basically you've got targets to hit, and it's easier to go and get the same 3 users day in, day out, day out, or whatever, or get people that are buying it rather than supplying it. Because then you get to seize assets. This is the strange thing about task force in America that a lot of people don't realise, is they're self-financed. They don't get financing from the government apart from initially. They make their money from from seizures and forfeitures of profits. So they find a small amount of drugs in here, then basically they can seize all the property, all the money.
There's no drugs in here, Neil.
No, of course there's not, but like they could claim that, and it would be down to me to prove that all of this stuff is not connected to the profits of drugs.
Right.
And so, you know, they finance themselves. They have a vested interest in basically seizing a lot of money and a lot of property off people that might not necessarily have the strongest case against them, and then it says you can tie it with plea bargaining and various other 3 strikes and you're out, which is a big thing in America.
Is crack a problem in the UK, or is it powdered cocaine? Is there a difference between crack and bog standard cocaine? I'm not really up on the
crack. The point about, well, here's an interesting thing as well. Okay, crack is you mix it with baking soda and water, allegedly, and you boil it down, and basically it makes it a lot stronger, but it also sort of spreads it so that you get more return on your investment, shall we say. Now, when crack first started in 1984, it was a way of, it was originally called freebasing.
I just interrupt you a minute, Neil. I'm not advocating, and we are not advocating breaking the law in any way, shape or form pertaining to drugs. We're just discussing the politics of it.
We're not, but Fox News does, and CNN does, and the government does, and I'll tell you for why. You go back and watch any of the when crack first came out.
On a new kind of cocaine called crack. It's going nationwide, especially among the young.
Compared with powdered cocaine used for sniffing, crack is 4 times as strong. 2 or 3 rocks in a vial for as little as $20 ready to smoke.
A new form of cocaine on the streets right now, cheap, powerful, cheap, really strong. Did we tell you how cheap it is? All the time that you see these just say no, war on drugs, all they're actually doing is they're telling you that this is very strong, it's available now, it's like cocaine, so you can be like those rich Hollywood people, like all the film stars, but it's also cheap. Did we mention how cheap and strong it is? Go back and look at any article that talks about crack. It's a marketing campaign.
I think you mentioned a phrase there, just say no. It might be a little bit before your time, I'm not sure, but the whole Grange Hill thing with Sam or Sammy, whatever he was called, there was one of the characters was on, well, probably heroin, I think it was. And there was this massive campaign, just say no, and they had a song as well.
And when they went to the White House, all the Grange
Hill they went to the White House,
round the back having a joint before they met the president.
What, they were they?
Yeah, they've admitted this. And this is the President Reagan who's basically responsible for the crack explosion. It's a bit, but that's the point. You set yourself up as one thing and basically promote that you're another thing in the public eye.
Right.
I mean, I'll give you an example of that. It would be the Sinaloa cartel. Everybody in America knows that it's the drugs cartels, it's the Mexican cartels. We've already used Guadalajara cartel. The Sinaloa cartel was, again, one of the largest cartels in America. These were the people that we said before providing 90% of the drugs in Chicago, now called Chirac, now a complete, total mess of a city. Financed, set up by the CIA, given protection by the American and the Mexican government. They basically were in cahoots with American Customs and Excise, the ATF, and the CIA, providing apparently intelligence on other cartels, which I don't believe either. It was just a way, this is the public perception. There were actually, Felipe Calderon, El Chapo seemed to be basically, he was the guy that ran the cartel, seemed to be almost bedfellows with him. He got arrested in 1993, and got sent to prison on sort of I forget what the actual charge was. But he lived in that prison like Grouty from Porridge. He ran it. He was like a hotel. Seriously, the prison guards were his servants. Like, people who went to visit him, he made it very, very clear, if I don't want you to leave, you're not leaving. This is my prison, I run it. In 2001, he was supposed to be extradited to America. A couple of days before this happened, in a laundry cart, he managed to escape from a maximum security prison. Come on, it never happens. Apparently, as it transpired, he paid off at least 78 prison guards, government officials and police. So he apparently went on the run for about 13 years, although it was during this time that he was actually trading information with the DEA and the CIA and the Mexican government. So this is nonsense. He was actually just propped up by the American government. He was also known to hang out in public places with celebrities and politicians, and his wedding, which was during the time that he was supposedly on the run, was protected by the American army and attended by Mexican and American politicians.
You talk about celebrities, it's fairly well accepted that the cocaine is the drug of choice with a lot of celebrities.
But this is my point, that's all right. It's seen as, oh, it's just that sort of thing, but it's depicted as something entirely different when you're arresting teenagers on a council estate or whatever. But as we look at it, the major problems, like the Sinaloa cartel, are financed by the Americans. Look at Fast and Furious. Fast and Furious was a sting operation that went wrong. Right, the ATF were providing Mexican cartels with over 1,700 machine guns. Right, the idea was that then they might sell these on, and then we might catch them selling these things on, and then we can arrest them. What actually happened was they just used these guns to kill American border patrol guards.
Right.
But that was it.
And you just wanted to mention the Los Zetas, which sound like a renegade tribe of extraterrestrials.
Well, these are the guys that are, you know, occasionally in Mexico you'll see like a dozen heads are thrown into a nightclub, or a dozen bodies are dropped on the.
Well, I'm from concerts, so I've seen that type of thing.
Well, but it does happen basically. So this is the ultra violent cartel that is now basically seems to be taking over from the Sinaloa cartel. They were public rivals to the Sinaloa cartel and the Juarez cartel and such like that. They're incredibly violent. They think nothing of cutting off heads with chainsaws and dumping bodies on the steps of police stations and such like that. They were formed by Guatemalan mercenaries trained by the CIA. Now, the official story about Los Zetas is that they were trained by the USA and Israeli special forces to combat all the other Mexican cartels, and then they went rogue. Right. So what they're expecting us to buy is that they did like Tommy Lee Jones's character in Under Siege. They were trained by the CIA and then went bad.
Yeah, they changed sides.
Of course, it wasn't that they were setting these up so that again, for all the reasons that we've suggested.
You were telling me about Lewis West.
Yeah, Lewis Jolly West. He was more famous for being an MK Ultra doctor. He actually lived in the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco to study the hippie in his natural environment, and he also once accidentally killed an elephant by giving it an overdose of LSD. He was connected to MK Ultra. He actually, during the Reagan era, tried to get a study of violent criminals, looking at the minds of violent criminals to see if we can alter their behaviour for the good of society. But I was reminded of a quote that he had. It was in a book called Hallucinations, Behaviour, Experience and Theory. And he said the role of drugs in the exercise of political control is also coming under increasing discussion. Control can be through prohibition or supply. The total or even partial prohibition of drugs gives the government considerable leverage for other types of control. One application would be the selective application of drug laws against selective components of the population, such as members of certain minority groups or political organisations. Now, if you look particularly in America, there's been two major drives that have been called the war on drugs. The first was in 1971 under Richard Nixon, where he said addictive drugs were the most dangerous thing in American society.
Let me just interrupt you there, Neil, because this is what your average person would think, that drugs are bad, or certain drugs are bad that we've made illegal.
Yeah.
The government then employ agencies in order to try and combat them, in order to keep people safe.
Yes, absolutely, for your own benefit. They're being completely altruistic about this. There's nothing to be gained from it. But
you would argue that even the ones that have been made illegal are being managed and being used for purposes of social control.
Absolutely, they would. I mean, just to give you an example, I mean, the first drug czar was a gentleman called Harry Anslinger, and he, along with Richard Nixon, basically pressed for the Drugs Act in 1971. What this was actually about, it wasn't to do with rising crime or rising rates of drug addiction or anything like that, aside from the heroin which was coming back from Vietnam. It was principally against marijuana at that time, and the reason was because it was a way to criminalise the youth movement. It was also a way to criminalise the Black Panther Party, and also specifically to persecute blacks and Mexicans with some degree of legitimacy, because, as I say, they were considered, you know, that's where a lot of the marijuana came from, particularly into California and such like that at the time. Similarly, the 1982 Reagan war on drugs was not actually based on crime or rising levels of criminality, but it was actually biased against black communities. It was launched in a response to racial politics, not increasing levels of drug addiction. The war on drugs in 1982 was actually part of the Republican Party's Southern policy. Now, the Southern policy was a marketing campaign that was arranged to appeal to poor white voters, particularly in southern states that actually that were threatened by civil rights. And so the Reagan administration actually paid news agencies and advertising companies to focus on the urban inner city, black neighborhoods, black drug dealers, black users, and to hype the supposed epidemic of crack babies. And this policy was basically used to swing the votes of certain Democrats towards the Republicans by putting a racial spin on the situation, basically stereotyping crime and drug crime as specifically a black problem that only the Republicans would be brave enough to deal with.
So somewhere like Harlem, Neil, that has had drug problems,
Yeah.
You think that's all been engineered then? Is that what you're saying?
I do, particularly Harlem. I mean,
how is it engineered? What is it? Not just people who've got nothing to do and they want to experiment with drugs, and then they tell their friends, and then it all pans out like that, and then the government try and combat it.
Well, where did the drugs come from in the first place? Now, particularly with Harlem. Now, prior to Harlem, basically, there's something that's connected with Cuba and the Mafia, because the Mafia seemed to be the conduit by which the CIA managed to flood America with drugs, particularly in the 1960s. I mean, the Mafia are basically, they don't deal drugs themselves. They get people like, two famous examples would be J. Sebring was dealing to the Hollywood crowd, and sometimes a gentleman called Charles Manson would also deal drugs for them as well. But the point is that in areas like Harlem, they had a gentleman called Frank Lucas. Now, initially, he was with Bumpy Johnson, and they were being basically supplied with the drugs by the Mafia, who were getting it from the French Connection. You may know that there's the film The French Connection, and that's where they were getting it from. What he managed to do was he managed to undercut the Mafia by getting it directly from the Golden Triangle. Now, how he managed to do this was he had a cousin, or someone who married his cousin, a Master Sergeant called Leslie Ike Atkinson, who was also better known as Sergeant Smack within the DEA and various other circles. What they did was they got this the heroin directly from the Golden Triangle and managed to ship it back to America in the coffins, some say in the body cavities of dead American soldiers, and this came to be known as the cadaver connection. The suggestion is that basically the CIA, DA and various other people allowed for this to happen. In fact, when Frank Lucas was actually apprehended many years later, somehow by turning informant he managed to reduce a 70-year sentence to just 2 years. That's pretty impressive.
All right, so the DEA, that's the Drug Enforcement Agency, you think were allowing certain major mass transportations of drugs into America?
Oh, I know they were. Like,
and for what purpose, Neil?
Well, I mean, in that particular instance, I mean, one of his business partners was Melvin Combs, who's Sean Puffy Combs, or Puff Daddy's father. The reason that I would suggest that they were doing that is to gentrify a population. What you can do is you can run down and economically ruin an entire city or an entire area, which then leaves abandoned neighbourhoods and run-down buildings. Corporate interests can come in, they can buy up the land for a greatly reduced price, and then they can put in things like condominiums. For example, recently in Harlem they had what was called the Harlem Renaissance, which is great apparently because Harlem's now got all these fabulous wealthy businesses and places to live and such like that, but the people who originally lived there have to move away. They have to move away. Are the CIA involved in drugs? Well, Michael Levine, a former DEA agent, said the CIA is the kingpin of the drugs game.
All right, well, let's just comment on something in now, because you're talking about the 1980s era. You told me what the nickname for Chicago currently is.
Yeah, Chirac.
Chirac.
Yeah, because he's got a higher death rate than Iraq. Like and
why is that?
Because basically you've got lots of gangs of young kids who are selling drugs and fighting each other for turf. Now, the reason that Chicago is so particularly plagued with drugs is to do with Mexican cartels, particularly the Sinaloa cartel. Sinaloa cartel was run by a gentleman called Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, or El Chapo, which means Shorty, it's his nickname. It was provably financed by the CIA. To allow, and the ATF, which allowed the constant flow from I think of about 2001 to about 2009 of drugs into Chicago. At one point the Sinaloa cartel was actually providing 90% of all drugs in Chicago, which gives you a perfect example of how these social situations can create such chaos. In a few years' time they'll sweep in and Chicago will be made into a very, very nice place to live, moving these people and basically, for want of a better phrase, letting them kill each other.
So you contend then that the CIA, if it wanted to, it could stop the flow of drugs and end a lot of this gun crime, is it? If it wanted to.
I think that drugs are used.
But it allows it to happen.
Yeah, I think that drugs are used alongside what is publicly perceived as criminal organisations, and it serves a lot of functions. It allows people to basically become lotus eaters, which basically means that they're not going to get involved with politics. It criminalises whole sections, and it causes chaos. It causes these own little sort of economic systems within cities. And then you can go further than that. It gives the government the perfect excuse to crack down on people. And this is before we've even get into the concept of the prison industrial complex, which is basically the use of drugs and harsh drug penalties, plea bargains, 3 strikes laws and such like that, to basically provide a prison population. What is the prison population? It's slave labour force for private owned companies like CCA, which was formerly known as WAC.
You used a term there, Neil, that I haven't heard before. Lotus eaters. What's that mean?
Lotus eaters is from, I think it's from the Iliad. It's the concept that you just sit there and do nothing. The drugs overtake you, and you're completely separate, or you've turned on and dropped out, as Timothy Leary might say.
So within government, shall we say, there is a concern that people might use their intellect to challenge what they're up to, policies and this kind of thing, in a genuine way, not in a yah-boo type way. But in order to stifle that, you think that the drug running, which has been run by the CIA, is all part of that. Part of the dumbing down of society as a whole.
And it can work on several ways. It can just demonise a population by making that association. It can give you physically stop you from getting involved, because if you're like this, then suddenly you don't feel like going and protesting or whatever. Or alternatively, what it can do is it can, as I say, demonise you in the eyes of the mainstream public. If you've got a criminal record, you're not going to be taken seriously. If you have a very salient point, regardless of how intellectually sound it is, if people can turn around and use your drug use as a bat to knock you down, and then basically make your point less legitimate in the eyes of the wider world.
I'm talking to Neil Sanders about how drugs are used, he would allege, to control society. Now, if we just take a step back from it for a moment, Neil, and consider what drugs are, a lot of them grow naturally on the planet, and this was a point that Bill Hicks used to make.
Why is marijuana against the law? It grows naturally upon our planet. Doesn't the idea of making nature against the law seem to you a bit paranoid? To make marijuana against the law is like saying God made a mistake.
You know, we've got alcohol, which is allowed, we've got tobacco, which is allowed, both which are naturally occurring, and then we've got some drugs which are naturally occurring which aren't allowed. So we've got a whole array of different chemicals we can put in our bodies that our governments have decided that those ones are bad, you're not going to use those, these ones are allowed. The ones that are allowed, you think are kind of pacifying the public in a way, like alcohol and tobacco. They're not really going to stimulate people mentally, whereas other drugs might.
Yes, yes, to an extent. However, I'm not one of these people that go for the sort of, you take acid once and suddenly you become enlightened and stuff like that. I know a lot of people that take a lot of acid, and a lot of them were pricks before they took it, and they're still like that afterwards. So, you know, it's not drugs per se, it's a substance. They're not an immediate channel into, you know,
higher consciousness.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that would do that. I have no problem with them, but I don't think that they're basically, you know.
Some people will contend that, sort of Terence McKenna, for example, he would say that he has had altered states of consciousness which could not be achieved without the use of narcotics.
Yeah, he's absolutely right.
And that they were real experiences. They weren't hallucinations, or he was connecting to something which he couldn't reach otherwise, this kind of thing.
Yeah, very
going
possibly.
on with that?
Yeah, with some things, but I think it very much depends on the person, the drug, and the scenario. I don't think there is a go-to. As I say, I don't think LSD is the path to enlightenment for everybody. I don't think that, but in the same way that some people are fine on a couple of drinks, some people turn into raging, you know, bores, basically.
So just to ask your opinion on this, then, would you legalise all drugs and then just tax them a bit, or what would you do? Because I think I would be of that mind.
Yeah, I would be of that mind.
Who is a government to tell you what you can and can't do to your own body. That's the way I would look at it.
Yeah, I'd look at it like that as well, but also purely because, not because I feel that there's any sort of like transcendental sort of enlightenment path for humanity on a whole, although I feel that can happen, but purely because the whole point of drugs is for this social control, and the circumstances exist where people feel that they want to use these sorts of things. Like people say, you know what, if you didn't want to get arrested for drugs, don't take drugs. And so you're absolutely right. I wish I was as happy as you. I wish I wasn't in the circumstances whereby you felt, because a lot of people do. People don't do it just to spite everybody else. They do it either because it's fun or because they feel that they wish to have an escape from the broader social conditions. If everybody was 100% happy, there would be no need for escape, would there? But that's too broad. We don't want to talk about that. Let's just blame them for shoving that stuff in their veins and put them in prison.
But to get back onto the point that you're making, and that is that I often think of government as having two arms. The visible government, the Obama, the Cameron that we see, and then there's the hidden. It's a bit like the jab and the right hook.
Absolutely, it's a problem. It's a created problem that's created by the governments as a distraction, as a sluice. Basically, this is a way of blaming all your ills on society. I mean, it's tied in basically with the concept of the prison industrial complex. The prison industrial complex is a system situated at the intersection of government and private interests. It uses prisons as a solution to social, political and economic problems. It includes human rights violations, slave labour, policing, courts, the media and the elimination of dissent. And one of the tools that is used in this system, this perpetuated system, is the flooding of particularly poor areas with drugs. And then again, look at the sort of
because
response.
and just to interrupt you there, and you're saying it's because they're not doing anything of any great use. People who live in certain areas, or that is how the officialdom would see them. Let's get them in prison and they can make circuit boards for Lockheed Martin.
Exactly. Once you're in prison.
But do you know if that happens in the UK, Neil?
Well, I don't know if it is.
Are people doing jobs in
Yeah,
prisons?
people do jobs in prisons, and they're all privately owned. I don't know specifically what it is. I know that in America they've got contracts with places like Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And I know that they make army military uniforms and bulletproof vests. And so this is the strange thing. So the prison industrial complex is this huge industry. So it's politically beneficial for you to have a prison because basically you're driving down unemployment, you're seen as being hard on crime, you're getting all these different disparate industries that are coming in and sort of spreading out like a spider's web. And you're showing that you're a good corporate citizen.
We've got Group 4 in the UK. They seem to be running a lot of this private security, and are they running prisons?
They run in prisons, they run in airport security, they also run certain power grids as well. They're one of these, and Leicester Police Force, I believe, they've got a hand in as well. But yes, this is the point. This is a private industry that says that it's doing a public service, and in actual fact what it's doing is it's utilising these people, providing this military industrial complex with a workforce that they don't have to pay taxes on. It's essentially like a slave labour. Also, look at the way that they treat poor people as as opposed to the way that they treat somebody like a celebrity, like Nigella Lawson's doing cocaine or something like that. But it's all right, we understand that. But if some sort of
did Nigella Lawson do cocaine?
Yeah, she did it. She admitted to it. But basically, it was just because she was upset. So perfectly legitimate. I mean, you could make the argument that lad that was,
maybe she put it in one of her pies.
Well, maybe she did. Maybe you could make the same argument that poor lad that's doing it, he's just doing it because he's upset as well. But no, that's all right because it's framed in a particularly different way.
See, I think a lot of people would say, well, it's against the law, therefore they need to be punished. They need to be put in prison. But you would say
I would say that it's not equal across the board. I'd suggest, depending on your position in society, whether you're a celebrity or a politician or whatever, then why is George Bush not in prison? George Bush is an admitted ex-cocaine addict.
And the other thing that you would contend is that particularly the CIA are fueling the drug use. But would you say it's the same in the UK? I've recently spoken to a chap whose son, well, he alleges was murdered, and he's in trying to get justice for his son. He's uncovered the murders of 5 other young men who were sort of on the fringes or knew about certain drug crime in London. Now, it appears from that there are a lot of corrupt police officers in the UK who are profiting from drug crime in the UK, and that goes to a very high level within the British police force, perhaps to Deputy Chief Constable, he alleges. So, but do you think it goes right to the top, or do you think it's just the fact that the drug lords have compromised a large number of police officers?
I know that Howard Marks, who was a marijuana importer, had a lot of connections with MI5, MI6, the mafia and certain other terrorist organisations, which seems very, very strange. But the point is that basically the drugs often come from a war scenario, Vietnam War, increasing Golden Triangle, increasing heroin in Afghanistan.
Yeah.
To use a quote from a film, ain't no poppy fields in Harlem. Nobody in South Central owns a plane. Nobody, they don't have these huge amounts of infrastructure. You could look at other
so it's got to get there somehow.
Yeah.
And to get it there requires quite a comprehensive logistical operation.
Yeah.
All right. So let's come on to the Iran-Contra, because that fits in nicely with this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So this was a war between Iran and Iraq.
Yes.
Just take it from there, Neil.
Well, that was basically it. I mean, Iran and Iraq were fighting, and basically there was a weapons embargo against Iran, so it was illegal to sell the weapons. But Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and through a conduit called Oliver North, them and certain members of the Israeli government decided that they wanted to actually supply Iran with weapons.
So who's imposed the ban on weapon sales to Iran?
I think it was an international embargo.
So maybe UN or something like that.
Yeah, violations.
But were the US supplying weapons to Iraq at that time?
Oh yes, absolutely.
Weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. We like to provide both sides of a war with, and
as they do. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
the idea was this: the legitimizing of it was that they were only supplying Iran with weapons so that this money could be used in order to finance the Contras who were fighting the socialist Sandinista government in Nicaragua. Somehow in all of this, as well as providing them with weapons and stuff like that, the Sandinistas decided very, very kindly to provide tons and tons and tons of cocaine, which went into America. This went through conduits, particularly Danilo Blandon, who was connected to the Nicaraguan government. It went through Panama under CIA asset Manuel Noriega, through the Guadalajara cartel, which was financed and set up by the CIA and at the time was the largest Mexican cartel, and then to people like Ricky Ross, which was then turned into crack and distributed in Ohio, St. Louis and Los Angeles. By strange coincidence, Compton and South Central Los Angeles has also been gentrified in the same way that Harlem has. So now it's actually a very, very pricey place to live.
So just the result of exporting arms to that conflict was to get a whole load of drugs back into the US.
Yes, which just so happened to be turned into crack and sold to specifically black people, which just so happened to coincide with the Republican Southern policy, which was demonising blacks in order to swing votes towards their
right.
party.
All right, let's come on to Danilo Blandon, is it?
Yeah.
Tell us about him.
Well, Danilo Blandon, he was basically initially headed Nicaragua's agricultural imports under Somoza, but in 1979 he fled to the US. He was a CIA asset, but he was basically protected by the CIA when he was funneling money and weapons to the Contras from the profits that were made with Freeway Ricky Ross and the Crips street gang in Los Angeles. And for example, he was arrested in 1986. But by 1982, for drugs peddling, all charges were dropped. He eventually became, he was a naturalised citizen. The INS, despite his criminal conviction, actually gave him an American passport and set him up. He now works for the DEA, for the Drugs Enforcement Agency, on a $42,000 a year job. But he was the guy that was basically, say, the conduit to get the drugs to Freeway Ricky Ross. He was also the person who would phone up and say, move your stash from here, here and here, there's going to be an investigation of that.
Right, and I have heard that happens in London as well.
Oh, I don't doubt it.
To the point where they've got the kettle on
for the police,
for the people who are going to raid the place, right? Okay, all right, Neil. Well, we're going to go for a break, and after the break, we're going to talk about Bill Clinton's alleged involvement in cocaine. I'm Richard D. Hall, and I'm talking to Neil Sanders about how drugs are used to control society. And I mentioned Bill Clinton before the break there. Now, I read in one of David Icke's books that Bill Clinton was running the Mina airstrip in his constituency and was allegedly importing large quantities of drugs in aeroplanes that were coming in. I mean, is there any truth to that, Neil?
Yeah, it's absolutely true. I mean, basically, he wasn't running it per se. He was just the governor of the state when it was going on. It was run by a gentleman called Barry Seal, who was a CIA contract air pilot since the mid-50s, and basically he had a very colourful career. Going backwards and forwards to South. He's actually South America. He's actually played by Dennis Hopper in a film. I forget the name of the film. He's a strange one, Barry Seal. Apparently, he was friends with David Ferry and Clay Shaw, who were involved with the JFK assassination, and allegedly he was in Dallas, Texas on the day and left in a plane, a Cessna or something, a small airplane, very, very shortly after JFK was assassinated.
Right.
But I don't know.
Now, so how do we know that Bill Clinton had knowledge of the Mina airstrip drug
because
operation?
Barry Seal had actually previously tried to set up this airstrip, he was dealing cocaine for the Medellin, which is basically run by Pablo Escobar for a time. The Medellin would basically, this cocaine would eventually end up in South Central in the hands of Michael Harris, or Harry-O, who was one of the principal founders of Death Row Records. Again, another way to demonise young black youth. He tried to set it up in Louisiana, and Louisiana says, no chance, you're not doing that, you're not bringing drugs into our state. Mina said, yeah, perfectly, that's perfectly legitimate. And so this is where he was. I mean, he was trained at...
So has he made confessions about all this?
Yeah, absolutely.
So where's he now then?
He's dead. He was murdered. Well, what happened was basically he got caught many times with large shipments of cocaine. Sometimes it went missing. Sometimes he got short sentences. Sometimes he miraculously got away with it. He was running cocaine off the back of the Iran-Contra thing, but sometimes from the Medellin as well, into America, and then it was distributed to various things. Bill Clinton was the governor of the state at the time, and so he was, it's in his jurisdiction. But it was with George H.W. Bush, George Bush Jr., Jeb Bush, and Ronald Reagan were also involved in the process. Now, in 1984, he got caught with a large shipment of cocaine, and the CIA seemingly backed away, and he was looking at an incredibly lengthy jail term. So he decided to turn state's evidence, and he was going to turn evidence against George H.W. Bush. He also claimed to have in his possession a videotape of George Bush Jr. and Jeb Bush collecting a large shipment of cocaine from an airstrip in Arkansas, and so obviously this is incredibly damning. The Clintons...
So themselves collecting it?
Apparently so. This is what Barry Seal said. So the Clintons were involved, the Bushes were involved, the Reagans were involved.
Allegedly.
Well, according to Barry Seal, they were involved. Now, this was going to go to trial, and he was given 6 months house arrest leading up to the actual trial. Unfortunately, someone turned up with an Uzi and machine gunned him to death, so we'll never find out the extent of that.
Right. I think there's a quote in Icke's book about Bill Clinton where he says, this is not an exact quote, something like, drugs are not what you think it is, the CIA control it, or something like that.
Yeah, well, which is pretty accurate, basically.
Right.
I mean, the other thing that he was involved in was off the back of the Contra deal. He arranged for the Sandinistas to actually receive a shipment of cocaine directly from Pablo Escobar. Now, this was framing the Sandinistas, and Reagan used this to say, see, it's the Sandinistas that are the drug dealers, that's why we're backing the Contras, when in actual fact it was the Contras that were actually dealing the drugs. Now, what's interesting was this was also at a similar time, this was a sort of a counter-propaganda thing, because the Sandinistas had come across a series of American government documents that proved that Manuel Noriega was a CIA asset in the 60s and the 70s, the dictator of Panama, and he was allowing the CIA to use the Guadalajara cartel in Mexico and ship huge amounts of cocaine through Panama. It was also the money was being laundered from the Contras in the first Inter-Americas Bank, which was also in Panama. The Sandinistas found this and threatened to expose this, and that's why the American government arrested Noriega and threw him in prison for the next 30 years. When his sentence ended, Hillary Clinton personally made sure that he was immediately extradited to France and began another incredibly lengthy sentence. So he's never going to see the light of day. It's probably to cover up his connections.
Right. And the dictator of Panama at that time was,
Manuel Noriega.
and a CIA asset.
Absolutely, he was a proven CIA asset throughout the 60s and the 70s, and I would suspect also during the 80s whilst he was involved in this drugs thing, although I imagine that they've tried to memory hold that so as to not show their implicit connection.
All right, Ian, well, some of the terminology that you use I'm not always familiar with. Tell us what the shower posse is.
Well, the shower posse is it's a Jamaican gang. Now, this is again, they were actually supplying the east coast of America with a lot of crack and a lot of cocaine and such like that. The shower posse was founded by a gentleman called Lester Coke, who changed his name to Jim Brown. Jim Brown was a nickname taken after the Raquel Welch.
Lester Coke, founder of the shower posse.
Well, this is him. And what he was he was aligned with the JLP and Edward Siega, who was, the JLP is the right-wing party in Jamaica. Now, they were opposed to the PNP, which was run by Michael Manley. Now, the American government also didn't like the PNP because it reeked of socialism, and we don't like socialism in America. We prefer the right wing. So they were approaching the shower posse. The shower posse made their name by, they would set fire to entire communities. He was also a building contractor, so the shower posse would go in, burn down all these houses, and then go to the government and say, hey, we can rebuild it for a price, obviously. And when they rebuilt it, they made sure that only JLP supporters would move in, and so it's a way of, like, you know, expanding your empire and such like that.
Right.
The CIA started to basically finance them because of their opposition to the PNP, just to use a quote.
And the PNP was supported by Bob Marley?
The PNP was supported by Bob Marley. I mean, CIA agent, just to give you an idea, in the 1980 election, over 1,000 people died in political clashes between PNP and JLP supporters.
How many?
Over 1,000.
Right, okay.
Right, okay. Can you imagine, like, barely that many people actually turn out to vote in England? Like, do you know? But CIA agent Philip McGee stated the CIA was using the JLP as its instrument against the Michael Manley government in the late 70s. I would say that most of the violence was coming from the JLP, and behind them was the CIA in terms of getting money and weapons in. The various other shower posse members like Cecil Connor claimed to have been trained by the CIA. Little Nut Miller confessed to 9 murders, but somehow got away with it. And when he was asked, how did you get away with it? He says, well, the American government made me what I am. Basically what they were doing, they were shipping drugs across America, from the west coast of America to the east coast of America, providing all the gangs in America with all this next levels of violence, and also shipping massive amounts of cocaine. And they were protected by the American government.
Right, well, let's just touch on the death of Bob Marley. If you go on Wikipedia and find out how Bob Marley died, it'll say he got an infection in his toe which spread to the rest of the body and he died. He was what, 37 or something like that, yeah. Obviously a healthy guy, very, you know, his songs were, let's say, had an element of politics in them.
Yeah.
They were advocating that people don't necessarily follow government line and all the rest of it, freedom, what have you, and he's involved in this PNP.
But there was basically a free concert that was in 1976, arranged by Michael Manley, which Bob Marley was supposed to play. He did actually end up playing. 2 days before it, the shower posse attempted to assassinate him. Lester Coke stated that he was paid by the CIA in massive quantities of cocaine to kill Bob Marley.
Right.
Later, obviously, Bob Marley got a cancerous infection in his toe, which then spread and eventually died. In a book called The Covert War on Rock and Roll by Alex Constantine, it suggests that William Colby's son basically gave him some boots, and in the boots was an infected piece of metal. This pierced his skin, and this actually caused the fast-causing cancer. Later, he was taken to a doctor that seemed to have some connections to the Nazi Party, and rather than actually, he was giving him a series of injections to the spine, I believe, through his stomach. And looking back on it, the practice was barbaric. So the suggestion is that perhaps this doctor also helped torture him to death rather than aid his recovery.
Okay, so do you think that Bob Marley was murdered?
Yeah, I do think Bob Marley was murdered.
Right.
Yeah.
All right.
The shower posse as well, they were getting their drugs shipped to them from a cartel in Colombia called the Cali Cartel. The Cali Cartel is intricately tied up with the Colombian government, or was at the time. And one of the things that the Cali Cartel did was they ran death squads that were basically going out at night and killing homeless children to make the cities a more pleasant place to live. Similar thing happened in Brazil just prior to the World Cup, actually. But these things happen. There are death squads that go out and get less desirables off the streets, shall we say. But unfortunately, as I say, we'll never find the true extent of the shower posse because he was eventually captured. The Interpol found that he was shipping massive quantities of drugs into America, and he was captured, and he was in a jail cell in Jamaica waiting to be extradited to America, where he could go on trial. The American agents were actually literally en route to pick him up, and unfortunately someone broke into his cell, doused him with petrol and burnt him to death. I think that was in 1992. It certainly appears that this would be to try and hide connections between the CIA, the shower posse, and drugs.
All right, Neil, well, we've run out of time now, but just give viewers your website address.
Yeah, sure, it's www.neilsandersmindcontrol.com, and also on Facebook. Yeah, if you want to get in touch with me via either of those mediums, please drop me a line.
All right, and remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.